Okay, welcome to Optical Mechanics. Today we talked to Drew Evans about his lovely image there of the Butterfly Nebula. He's going to go through a bit of his background in astronomy and then move on to the discussion of the image itself and how he captured that. So we're just going to jump in now. Can you tell us a bit about how you got into astronomy and your background there?
Sure, my pleasure, Andrew. Nice to join you and your website. A little bit about me. I live in Flagstaff, Arizona, northern Arizona, USA. Moved here about 5 years ago. Lived on the East Coast my entire life outside of Philadelphia in a very light polluted area. We always wanted to be out in the Southwest come retirement. And really when COVID hit, it was an opportunity really with my wife and I working remotely to be out out here, away from work, working remotely on the West Coast. So the image itself, as you can see in my background here, like you mentioned, is an image of the Butterfly Nebula region of it. It's more of a less of a wide field view, more of an in-depth view of the core of the Butterfly Nebula, and that determination or category is IC1310. Really, the palette I used for it, again, this was shot in mono. I'll send you the Astrobin link, or if I post it to your visitors, they can take a deeper look at a deeper dive of the image. Before I get really in depth on the image itself, how I got started in astronomy and astrophotography, ever since I was a kid, living on the East Coast, I've always had an interest in astronomy. Took many courses of it in college. I'm a graduate of Penn State University. I've always had a general interest in astronomy. As my children started getting a little older, I had a little bit more time on my hands to dive into astrophotography. I've been in that hobby now probably about 15, 20 years. The past, I'd say 5 years is really when it became more of a deeper dive into it with the great skies we have here in northern Arizona, very close to Bortle 1.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
So, that really gave me the opportunity to do a deeper dive, get better equipment, take images really that I could never do on the East Coast, even with the greatest light pollution filters. But, it's northern Arizona is blessed with, not a whole lot of population. We live in a very rural area. I have a built observatory in my backyard, so I'm able to image anywhere really with an internet connection. So I do a lot of that when I'm traveling. I'll be able to roll off the roof and take images just like this. So getting back into the image, like I said, it's a picture of the Butterfly Nebula. You can see really the core of the nebula is that black area that expands, and the filters I use with this are hydrogen alpha and oxygen. So it's really just two filters I used on a monochrome camera, and I mapped those colors accordingly. So the colors really I mapped, the red and the pinks to the hydrogen alpha, and the blue is a traditional oxygen color. The exposures itself, they were taken in early June of last summer. So it's a constellation that's optimal viewing in early June. And that's when I got a total accumulation of about 50 hours of time. So I take this image over many, many nights, 6 or 7 nights of good seeing, good visibility, clear nights.
Yeah.
I produce an image of multiple nights all stacked together with calibration frames, of course. So that's essentially how I take the images with a broadband filter, or really no filter at all. You would see a much different picture than this. You would see what colors your eyes see. So with these filters, they block out essentially a certain wavelength of light, and that's what this is a beautiful image like this. Yeah, so essentially what I'll do for a couple nights is, I'll shoot hydrogen alpha. Depending on how those nights come out, I always check my data, usually the night or night after, to see if I want to continue. That's a good question. It's really a process of trying to get, number one, the framing good. If you have a good focal length, of course, you have a longer focal length, you're going to get more deep sky. The more wide focal length, you'll see much more of the Butterfly Nebula. But in this picture, let me see exactly, I don't know off the top of my hand. So this was taken with my Sharp Star SCA 260. That is a reflector, and that actually, I believe it's about 1,200 to 1,300 millimeter. We're going with a much wider field of view. You would see the Butterfly Nebula from further away. So this was a pretty deep, moderately deep telescope that I.
Right. Okay. I think I actually pulled up a picture of this for our viewers to see as I share that.
Yeah.
So this is the piece of equipment that you're using.
That's it. Yeah. So that's the Sharpstar SCA-260. It's a relatively fast telescope. I think I was down to like F3 or F4 with that. So you're able to gather significantly more light than, let's say, a refractor of that size or lower even. But yeah, I've had a lot of luck with that telescope. It's a great reflector, gathers a lot of light, real big, not real big, but moderately sized mirror for picking up all that light that you want to capture on a nightly basis.
Right. And you say you've basically a setup in your garden or your yard, which is permanently
in my backyard. I have a remote. I call it a remote observatory just because I don't like going outside up here in northern Arizona. Late at night, it gets very cold. We're above 8,000 feet elevation. So I said to access remotely, really. Even in Hawaii, we were in Hawaii last month. We had a couple clear nights back here, and I was able to remotely log in and open the roof and set up my imaging sessions.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, I'd be happy to share that link with you to the observatory too for your visitors if you want to see.
Oh, that'd be great. Thank you very much. Yeah, that's wonderful. Okay. I was reading some of the details you put on the website. Was that you're cooling this to minus 10 degrees C? Is that correct?
Yes. Now I will have to. Now at night we're getting to almost below freezing. I think our temperature last night was 7 degrees Fahrenheit.
Right.
Out back. So as soon as I open that roof, it's already minus 10. I know they do Celsius, but there's an option to change, between temperature Fahrenheit and Celsius on the scope. And the reason we do that, Andrew, is we want that when we're taking long exposures. I think, let me go back to the specs on these shots, but I was taking 600-second exposures each for these photos, and there were 144 both in hydrogen alpha and oxygen. So you can imagine a 10-minute exposure is what that is. You're keeping that camera going for 10 minutes. And as you keep expanding that time, 10 minutes, the sensor gets very hot. And what that fan does on the camera is it cools off the sensor to alleviate any noise on it. That's why it's very important to keep that camera cooled, and that's what we use those astrophotography cameras for. So, going back to the exposures, the hydrogen alpha was 144 times 600 seconds, and that equates to 24 hours just in hydrogen alpha on this photo.
Right.
Same thing. So if I was to keep the camera going for 24 hours straight, that's what the bit of hydrogen alpha would be. Same with oxygen, but obviously, you don't want to do that. There's many frames I throw out because a plane flies by or a cloud goes overhead. So that's 144 times 600. Obviously, the longer you shoot, the more detail you're going to capture in an image, especially with a light like this.
Yeah. So when you go to the kind of post-processing, how much of a kind of manual task is that versus automated with the tools these days?
Yeah, it's a good question. Tools have been great. I mean, 10, 15 years ago, a lot would have been done manually in Photoshop after stocking images. I use PixInsight. I think it's the best program out there for calibration, putting all your frames together. Really, from an automated standpoint, I use weighted batch pre-processing, which kind of aligns all your calibration frames, all your light frames, and it runs by itself for an hour and a half. It produces a final image, in a FITS file. And then from there on is when you really do the tweaking of it. So to answer your question, I would spend probably like an hour post-processing, after all the calibration frames are all worked out in PixInsight to produce an image like this. It really all depends on the detail. If you're doing, a galaxy where, you can steal my astrobin, there's a lot of galaxies where there's not a whole lot of editing to do. But in an image like this, you really want to draw out, the contrast in the nebula, the star colors, especially using photo.
So kind of apart from this image, are there any other kind of images in the sky that you really would love to take that you haven't done yet?
Yeah, I mean, the Southern Hemisphere, I think you're blessed with some great targets down there, Andrew. Someday I would love to get down to the Southern Hemisphere. Being in Arizona. Of course, we're a little bit further south than I was on the East Coast, but
Yeah.
I'd love to get out to, definitely to the Southern Hemisphere some point soon to see what you have to offer. Of course, moving a telescope like that size is probably impossible.
Yeah.
To probably like renting a telescope in the near future to take images like this in the Southern Hemisphere.
Right. Okay. Okay. And when you started off, what kind of equipment were you using back then?
It's a good question. It's changed so much in the past, I'd say 2 decades. I was using a simple point and shoot, DSLR, really even with an untracking
Yeah.
mount. One that didn't track on just a tripod, I would take single shots. But it's a very, very basic, point and shoot. I think it was a Canon Digital Rebel that I was using probably in the late 90s, early 2000s.
Mhm.
That graduated onto, a tracking mount like Takahashi. I think that was a Sky Patrol mount that, the DSLR would fit on, and you're able to take much more wide field. But I've really graduated from beyond wide field to more deep sky. Deep sky photos much deeper
Mhm.
than the one here of the Butterfly Nebula.
Okay. Can you kind of explain to our kind of viewers how the tracking works these days? How does the
Yeah,
mechanism
it's
keep?
become so much easier too. Before you had to manually, polar align, to the North Star, of course, here in the Northern Hemisphere. And
Mhm.
we're very fine tuned, especially, 10, 15 years ago to get a 600-second, 10-minute exposure with the very rudimentary tracking setup back then, it would be very hard to do. Now, a lot of equipment, a lot of mounts are very, very easy to use. You basically put the mount in the general vicinity of the North Star around Polaris, and it'll get you there. So I think to answer your
Right. Okay.
question, become much more facilitated with the equipment we're using too. A lot of computer generated assisted polar aligning that's out there on the market.
Yeah. Cool. Cool.
And that is so key to long exposures too. You know,
Yes.
polar alignment is off, you're going to get star trails all over the place, and the guiding isn't so great. Even with a guiding setup,
Yeah.
your star trails and everything will be off. But this image is a prime example, taking 10-minute exposures, nice round stars, and the mount I think I used for this was, let me double check on that, an Ioptron. I think I have that on the 120. Yeah, the CEM 120, which is a very beefy mount. The CEM
Yeah.
120 is capable of, I think, the 120-pound payload with this particular OTA. The SEA 260 is probably a quarter of the capacity that mount can handle. So this mount did very,
Right.
very well.
I suppose one of those general questions is kind of how much time do you kind of dedicate to this
Good
activity?
question too. Not as much as I want to. In fact, a couple of my friends we were just talking about, I gather more data than I have time to process. I
Right.
have, in fact, just posted a wide field shot of the core of the Milky Way. I guess it was last week, and that was taken probably early August of last summer. And I'm just getting it around to process stuff like that. My children are very involved with sports and with my work. It's a matter of when I can get to the data. I know it's sitting there, but I enjoy just as much processing as I do gathering the data. Just setting things up and
Yeah.
seeing those images come in off the
Right.
sensor are equally as enjoyable as processing. So I get to the data when I can.
Right. Fair enough. Fair enough. And how much data does an image like this take? In gigabytes, for example.
That's another good question. I think the drive that I have all my data on right now is about 120 terabytes. So an image like this, with all of the subs, the darks, the calibration frames, I would assume probably about half a terabyte worth of data itself.
Okay. Fair enough. And I suppose, do you have any advice on a new person coming into this field, where they should
Sure.
start?
From what I've learned, and the biggest thing, Andrew, is patience. A lot of
Yeah.
individuals try to jump into the hobby. It's not a cheap hobby, number one, and they'll buy something expensive, get very frustrated, and they'll get burned out from it. I always suggest everybody to start small. Learn how polar alignment works. Buy a relatively modest camera. I think your most important piece of the equipment is your mount. because the mount's really what's going to drive. It's the engine to everything you're doing. The mount, I would start with a very good mount. Be patient, learn the process. I can't stress enough. Look on YouTube. YouTube is just so many instructional videos. I've learned so much from my friends and people who are posting, videos on how to. Really, that really assisted me along the way. But start small, be patient. It's not something that you want to jump right into. There's a huge learning curve, not with just the acquisition of astrophotography photos, but the process. The processing of them is a whole other learning curve in itself.
I think that's the kind of all the questions I have today. Any other things you'd like to share before we finish up?
No, I really appreciate you letting me join, and anytime we could do maybe another interview and talk about really more like a processing, how these images are processed. They're great to look at, but there's a whole other step behind the processing of them. And yeah, I really appreciate you having me on. And like I said, I'll provide some links to my other images, and happy to answer any other questions your audience may have.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Drew, for being with us. And I think I'll definitely be tapping you on the shoulder to take you up with that other offer. That'd be great. So thank you very much.